Hello, Daniel. It's really wonderful to see you again, albeit through a screen. And we're so grateful that you joined us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to just jump right in because we have a lot to discuss, and I know our audience is very eager to hear from you. Recently, journalist Peter Beinart, who has long been a fixture on the Zionist left, wrote an article that caused quite a stir in the Jewish world, in which he argued that the time has come to give up on the idea of a two-state solution for a binational state that would be called Israel-Palestine. So essentially, Beinart was arguing for the end of the Jewish state. In response, you wrote a very eloquent piece in defense of both the Jewish state and the two-state solution. So before we delve further into the continued fight for a two-state solution, could you just briefly summarize what Beinart argued in his piece?
Yeah, I mean, without going into the whole analogy that he makes to Yavne and that Talmudic incident, because I think it's not really critical to his thesis, even though that's in the title, he basically argues that he thinks we're not making any progress towards this two-state solution, that Israelis are not interested in a two-state solution, the occupation is getting more and more entrenched, there's no pressure on Israel to change anything, and so therefore it's time to recognize that little incremental changes aren't going to make a difference. It's time to acknowledge that we need to have something here between the river and the sea in which Palestinians and Jews have equity, equality. He doesn't quite say exactly what it is. It's a confederation. It's two peoples, one state. It's a non-state. But basically, there will be no state, the purpose of which is to be a Jewish and democratic state. It would be something else. Very much similar, perhaps, to what Ahad Ha'am might have been talking about a very long time ago at the end of the 19th century. But he argues that this idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state should end because otherwise there'll never be equity for the Palestinians.
So we at AJC are longtime supporters of the two-state solution as the only realistic resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we know that you agree. So could you tell our viewers why, in your opinion, the two-state solution needs to remain the goal for solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? In other words, where does Beinart go wrong?
Well, Beinart goes wrong on a whole array of levels. I mean, Beinart goes wrong in assuming that Jews and Palestinians are somehow going to defend themselves together. I mean, you have to now imagine wrapping together the IDF and Hamas, or the Palestinian Authority troops, under one shared command. I mean, that's a little hard to imagine. He goes wrong in trying to imagine some sort of shared governmental structure, and then it comes up for voting. Okay, now we want to let all of the millions of Palestinian refugees who are defined as refugees by UNRWA, because Palestinian refugees are defined differently than refugees of any other people. We want to let all those millions of people now come into whatever this new country is called. The Jews are going to vote no because they'll become an even smaller minority. The Palestinians are going to go yes because they want to become an even greater majority. It falls apart on that. I mean, it falls apart on so many levels. Ambassador Dan Shapiro called it naive nonsense. It's just, and he's about an understated and thoughtful and diplomatic a person as one is going to find out there. And he just called it nonsense. But I think really the bigger issue, it has got nothing to do with the Palestinians, where Peter goes wrong. Because what Peter and I, whenever we've debated, and we're not doing that anymore, but whenever we had debated in the past, what I've always felt that he doesn't understand is Israel is not the Palestinian conflict. It's like saying a year ago, before America exploded into what it's exploded into now, which is very complicated, and I'm not putting an issue on it. But if 2 years ago somebody had said about America, the only thing that you can talk about America is race, they would have been quite right that race is a huge issue in America that needs to be addressed. And they would have been quite wrong that that's the only thing about America that's worth talking about. And I think that the kind of myopic conversation that American Jews, on both sides, by the way, this is not a left-right issue, I think on both sides, tend to have about the conversation that we have about Israel is actually about Israel's conflict with its enemies. We never actually talk about what Israel is without Palestinians or other enemies in the picture. So it doesn't matter if you're in a left-wing congregation or a right-wing congregation. If you're in the left wing, then you're talking about occupation, you're talking about annexation, you're talking about whatever. If you're on the right, then you're talking about Iran, and you're talking about Hezbollah, and you're talking about whether or not a specific American administration is good for Israel or bad for Israel. But what those left and right conversations actually have in common is they're only talking about Israel as a country in conflict with the Palestinians. There's nothing in there that captures any of the rebirth of the Jewish people that Israel has made possible. There's nothing in that. We talked about Haram a second ago, but there's nothing in there about, the rebirth of Jewish language, the rebirth of Jewish literature, or what Shmuel Rosner has written about with Camille Fuchs about kind of the emergence of a kind of a new Judaism. I mean, it sounds heretical to some people, but a kind of a new Judaism, which is a blend of a nationalist Judaism and a religious Judaism, which is much more far-encompassing, wide-encompassing than many people imagine. And again, when I wrote and I said about Peter, there were two things that he said that I thought were really wrong. One of them, he says that, we're getting very close to Israelis being willing to do ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. That's just ludicrous. That's ludicrous. And what I pointed out was that you actually really can't say something like that if you don't have the ability to read the Hebrew press. Because what gets translated into English is actually a very small fraction of that. And if you read the Hebrew press, then you understand that there's discussions about annexation, yes and no, and maybe, and this and that. And there's discussions about every other issue, a lot about Corona these days, and a lot about what's happening to America these days, and a gazillion other issues. Nobody talks about ethnic cleansing. It's kind of an unthinkable way to go. And of course, there's occasionally a soundbite from some crazy right-wing person who'll talk that way because you don't have access to the full plethora of views that are represented in the Israeli press. You kind of think, oh, that's one of the views out there, but it's not. And I think, therefore, again, not speaking Hebrew is not a character flaw. We only know the languages that our parents got us to learn. But so not speaking Hebrew doesn't mean that one can't be involved in the Israel conversation. I'm not suggesting that at all. But it does mean that one has to have a certain amount of humility about how well they understand the deep impulses of the society that we're talking about. And I think so what Peter basically gets his information through sources translated into English. He sees Israel only as a political entity in conflict with another nation, which it is, but it is so much more than that. And I think that the entire discourse that he's constructed misses the entire miraculous nature of the rebirth of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And that to me is a tragedy.
You raise such important ideas that are linked to two different directions I want to go in for our interview. One of them is the case for the two-state solution, which I want to delve a little bit more into now. And the other, which I'm going to get to in a little while, is the Israeli diaspora divide. Some of the reasons that we are feeling this divide, I think you've already touched upon here, and I'd love to delve into them more in a few minutes. But let's stick with the two-state solution at first. So is there hope for the two-state solution?
So when Menachem Begin and Jimmy Carter were negotiating at Camp David, which was not going well, and Menachem Begin detested Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter detested Menachem Begin, Carter at one point snapped to Begin and said, look, this is your last chance to make peace with Egypt. And Begin looked at him and said, we've been around for thousands of years. We just don't believe in last chances. This is not the last chance. I'm here because I would like to try to make peace. But if we don't make peace now, maybe we'll make peace later. There are no such things as last chances. And I think it's important for us to remember, and I say this not disparagingly. I mean, I really don't mean the following disparagingly, but it is a particular quality of an American worldview that all problems have to have an obvious, clear solution to point to. And when they don't, we get exceedingly frustrated. And I think we're dealing with that now in America in a lot of different kinds of ways, whether it's COVID, whether it's race, whether it's political discourse, whatever, right? And I think part of the frustration is we're used to knowing, okay, that's the problem, that's the answer. So is there hope for the two-state solution? Probably not in my lifetime. I'm probably not going to live to see it. But what I think Israelis need to do is several things. And then I'll talk about what Palestinians need to do. What Israelis needs to do is to, first of all, educate our kids not to hate Palestinians. Most of us don't, but some of us do. And we need to stop that. We need to educate our kids to believe in the possibility of peace, even if my generation may not live to see it. We need to educate our kids to understand that there are two peoples here that are one way or the other going to both living here. Nobody's kicking the Jews out and nobody's kicking the Palestinians out. So we have to decide, do we want to be at war? Do we want to figure something out? I think that's the long haul for us, and we have to not do anything that would preclude the possibility of peace down the road. And I just want to remind you, obviously, we did a lot of things that would have seemed to preclude the possibility of Gaza going back. But it turns out that D9 bulldozers are very, very big bulldozers. And if you want to destroy towns that you've built, you can. And so the fact that a settlement has been built here or a settlement's been built there, I'm not necessarily in favor of building those settlements. But just because they get built doesn't mean, oh my God, that's now another place that's never going back. There's no realities on the ground that can't be changed. I'm not suggesting that we should be stupid. We shouldn't be stupid, but it's important to recognize that. Look, the Palestinians have to make their own changes as well. They need to accept the fact that the Jews are not going anywhere. And again, it's very hard to know how to measure Palestinian views. What do the Palestinians think? What do the Americans think about whatever, right? I mean, what do Americans think? It's a meaningless question. But we say the Palestinians think as if it's obviously what the Palestinians think. They don't all think the same thing. Some of it's generational. Some of it's religious versus secular. Some of it is about intellectual dispositions. Some Palestinians actually still do want to make a deal with Israel. They desperately don't want to live under the Palestinian Authority. So those who live, for example, in East Jerusalem would definitely rather be Israeli citizens than Palestinian citizens. Some Palestinians understand that one country between the river and the sea is very quickly the Palestinian Authority between the river and the sea. And any benefit they get from the Israeli economy now by virtue of working in it or around it disappears because the likelihood of that surviving is pretty remote. And there are also some very hard-nosed Palestinians who would say, yeah, we've run out of patience for the two-state solution, and it's time to do a one-state. Do I know what the percentages are? I actually have no idea what the percentages are. What I do know where the percentages are high is that the imams in the mosques are saying exactly the wrong thing. And that the Palestinian leadership, like Abbas and many others, are saying exactly the wrong thing. When Mahmoud Abbas says, which he says periodically, that there was no temple on the Temple Mount, he doesn't call it the Temple Mount, right? He says there was no temple there. He's not just being a fool from the point of view of history. What he's saying is the Jews just weren't here back then. The Crusaders came and went. The Ottomans came and went. The British came and went. The Jews came, and they will one day go. And we have to kind of not think of him as a kind of an old 80-year-old man who's kind of just doesn't really get it anymore, but to understand that he's very shrewd. And what he's communicating to the Palestinians is that Jewish residence here is temporary. And if you ask me, we're coming about, it depends on when you started, but the conflict was certainly in full bloom by 1929, and many people actually trace it to 1920. So we're basically at about 100 years of conflict thus far. And while a lot of things have changed, one thing that has not changed on the Palestinian side is the view that they can actually get the Jews not to be here. And so if the Israelis keep an open mind for peace and understand that these people are not evil by virtue of their being Palestinians, that they are also a people here that we're going to need to learn to live with, and the Palestinians can slowly make a switch towards a greater understanding and embrace of the West and compromise and so on and so forth, I think we can get there. I really don't believe that I'll live to see it. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying for. Our people prayed for 2,000 years to come back to the land of Israel. And the vast majority of people who said that in their davening 3 times a day knew full well they would never live to see it. But we kept the dream alive, and now we're here. I think there's other dreams we have to keep alive too.
So you say very, very eloquently that we're really at a stalemate that may not get resolved in your lifetime, my lifetime, who knows whose lifetime. Is there anything that can be done now on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, that can help us move in a good direction?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we could do. I mean, I don't know that it would actually result in a deal right away. We're not going to have one of those big signings on the White House lawn very soon. Yeah. But I think that Israel should be in a position of constantly reaching out to the Palestinians. Meet us in Paris, meet us in London, meet us in Brussels, meet us here, meet us there. We'll talk. We want to offer something to you now. I think, first of all, we would gain a tremendous amount of PR credit in the international community, especially in Europe. I think that, because basically, we were just talking before we went on the air, you and I, about how, you and your family came to Israel in 2000, which is when the Second Intifada started. That's when the peace process ended. The peace process ended exactly 20 years ago. So that means that even people who are 30 years old really have no recollection of there being an actual peace process. And I think that that's a very painful, hard place to be. I obviously remember it. You obviously remember it. But a lot of people don't. And I think that for young American Jews, I know we're going to come back to that relationship a little bit later, but I think for a lot of American Jews, simply to see Israel reaching out the branch of peace, let's talk about this or that or the other thing, would I think do a tremendous amount of good. So I think there is that. Look, I think Israel does not have the best leadership that it's ever had. I think America doesn't have the best leadership that it's ever had. I think England doesn't have the best leadership it's ever had. There's a lot of countries right now that don't have the best leadership they've ever had. But one of the many things, and Netanyahu, by the way, has done a lot of things right, a lot of things wrong. One of the things that I think he has been guilty of, and most Israelis I think would say this, is a certain amount of race baiting of Israeli Arabs when it comes to election time. And I think that serves us terribly. It gives the wrong impression about Israel. It's exactly the opposite of what leadership should be. And if Israelis could work more on the relationship internally that we have with Israel's Arabs, which is not horrendous, but it needs to be improved, like the position of minorities in any modern country needs to be improved, I think that would actually bleed over to how Israelis think about Arabs and Palestinians in general. And then I think there's education. We just simply have to teach, as I said before, teach our kids to be open-minded and to have our eye on the long ball. You know, much more than that, I'm not sure that we can really do. Some people say we should stop building altogether over the Green Line. Maybe yes, maybe no, it really depends. I mean, part of the argument against not building, that was a double negative on purpose, right? In other words, part of the argument that I think people who say we have to stop building right now, the argument against that is as long as you hold that out, the Palestinians have no incentive to move. I mean, part of the reason that you began to see before COVID, it took the spotlight completely off annexation, there was the possibility of the Palestinians coming to the table with some alternate plan. It came and went, that little rumor, very quickly. But they didn't do it until really the clock was about to strike midnight. If they know that there's going to be no construction anywhere over the Green Line until there's a deal, well, there's absolutely no incentive to make a deal. If they see the clock ticking and things moving against them in a certain kind of ways, then there's more incentive. Now, we could have a whole long conversation that we don't have time for now about ways in which the international community has not only not incentivized the Palestinians to come to the table and to be more flexible, but has actually disincentivized the Palestinians to come to the table. I mean, the United States has never taken a strong enough position on the fact that if you're a suicide bomber and the Palestinians then give your family a lifetime of financial support, so you're a 21-year-old kid and you want your family, this is not an exaggeration, this is not hyperbole. You're a 21-year-old kid, your family lives in a very, very modest apartment, and you would like to be the one that got them the big house. Go blow yourself up in a restaurant and they will actually get the big house. That sounds ludicrous and it sounds like he's got to be making this up, but it's actually true. And while America has spoken out against that, most of Europe hasn't. And the United States has not really been able to turn the screws quite the way that it did for a while with Iran, for example. So there's lots of ways in which the Palestinians, I think, have been disincentivized from coming to the table. But I don't vote in the Palestinian Authority. Of course, nobody votes in the Palestinian Authority these days. But even if they did have elections, and Abbas is in the 16th year of a four-year term. I forget what year he's in. I kind of forgot to call an election. But I vote in Israel. That's the only country in the world that I vote in. And what I want to be able to vote for is for leadership that says we may not live to see this now, but we believe in the possibility of there being a Jewish and democratic state along some sort of Palestinian entity. You can call it a state, you can call it whatever you want to call it, and I don't think that those are hairs worth splitting at the moment. Yes, it'll be demilitarized. Yes, we'll probably keep the Jordan River Valley, and the Palestinians have to decide, do they want more independence, or do they want to fight more over the principle of the Jordan River Valley, which Israel's very unlikely to compromise on, etc. So I think there's a lot we can do. But we should not expect either Israelis or, frankly, American Jews on the left or on the right or even in the middle. A solution to this that's going to be immediate. We have to have our eyes on a very, very long ball and be patient. The last sentence I'll say is that I think the more that we think about Israel in terms that are not conflict terms, the more inspiring Israel is. If Israel is only the conflict, then I really want no part of it. I mean, it's just disgusting and it's tiring and it's embarrassing and it's just eroding and corrosive of all of my positive Jewish feelings. But if I'm reading David Grossman and I'm reading Aleph Bet Yehoshua, thank God both of whom are very much alive and well, and I'm reading Eli Amir, who's alive and well, and I'm watching what's happening in Israeli culture and in Israeli literature and in Israeli theater and Israeli thinking about religion and Judaism and so on and so forth, then I say, oh my God, what you have there is a petri dish in the very best sense of the word for a flowering of something new. It is sadly, tragically mired in conflict, but that's not what it's about. And I think, that's the direction that American Jews have to begin to push themselves in.
That actually is a perfect segue into our conversation about Israel-diaspora relations. So you actually wrote a book on Israel-diaspora relations. So could you just give us a little overview of what you argue? What is going wrong in our relationship? Obviously there's been a great deal that's been written about the fraying of the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. There have been studies that have shown that that is actually the case, particularly among the younger generations. The connection does not seem to be as strong as it once was. What is the nature of that fraying? Why is it going on, and what can we do to solve it? Maybe we could break those down, but let's start with what's the nature of the problem?
Okay, so obviously because we're talking about a Jewish issue, there are disagreements. I mean, for example, if you look at stuff put out by the Ruderman Foundation, who are very smart people and very lovely people and very serious people, they argue that the relationship is not fraying. I think that the evidence doesn't add up. I think they're mistaken, even though I admire them and know a lot of people who work there. But nonetheless, I think that you can see the relationship fraying in a lot of ways. You can see it where, look, we know that 70% of American Jews vote Democratic. And although Biden, in the end of the day, got the nomination, you could see where the crux or the heavy mass of candidates were on Israel. You could kind of see Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, a whole array of people, Elizabeth Warren. I mean, these were all, decent human beings. Some of them I like more, some of them I like less. But they were all, in my view, in a not very good place when it came to Israel, and that had nothing to do with in any way mitigating the rabid support of young American Jews for some of these candidates. I think Peter Beinart represents their viewpoint, and I think I don't know what's cause and what's effect, but I think what he writes really very much affects where they are. Now, look, the question is, how did we get here? And there's a lot of ways in which we got here, and we don't have a ton of time, but I'll say, first of all, look, I think here's a way in which we were all guilty. Major Jewish organizations, the State of Israel, the American Jewish establishment, which is a phrase that Peter loves to use. We sold Israel as a kind of, oh my God, if you don't support them, they're going to get annihilated, which may have been true in 1948, and it may have been true in 1967. It was definitely true for a few weeks in 1973, but it has not ever been true since 1973. Don't get me wrong. I think that the fact that American Jewish organizations were able to get funding for Iron Dome is a huge thing. The fact that we get $3.25 billion a year in American military support is a huge thing. But Israel has never been on the verge of annihilation, ever, since October 1973. The Second Intifada was a horrible time. You were there with your family. I was there with my family. Buses were blowing up. Restaurants were blowing up. People were depressed. People were scared. But you can't destroy a country by blowing up its restaurants. In other words, you have to put boots on the ground. You can't do that without tanks and airplanes and all of that, and they don't have any of that. So they can wreak havoc, but they can't destroy us. But it was an easy way to get Jewish philanthropists and, frankly, rank-and-file Jews to, get with the program and support Israel. And what we did in the long run is, again, we portrayed Israel as a conflict issue, nothing else. So that's piece number one. Piece number two, and here's what I argue in the book, and the reason that everybody center and left kind of completely panned the book, which was not, I was kind of surprised at the monolithic nature of the left of center panning of it. I would have thought that somebody on the left would have said something that was a little bit less predictable, but I was wrong. But you can check out the New York Times review of it and all that kind of stuff. They actually, of course, didn't like it. Because I argue that as critical an issue as the conflict is, and as critical issue as the occupation is, it's not the reason that American Jews are walking away from Israel. The reason that I argue that they're walking away from Israel to whatever extent they are is because American Judaism and Israeli Judaism are now really different animals. Really, really, really different animals. Without going into lots of detail, America is a fundamentally universalist kind of a culture. Not just American Judaism, but America in general. It's very much a kind of a universalist culture. And in America, by the way, Judaism is perceived as being a religion or a culture, but certainly not a people. right? Because then when the president says from the Oval Office, God bless the American people, if we're also part of the Jewish people, are we part of the American people? Are we not part of the American people? So American Jews have shied for a very long time away from this category called peoplehood. The irony, of course, though, is that religions don't have countries. Peoples have countries, right? In other words, where's the Methodist country? Where's the country for the Presbyterians? Peoples have countries. And because if you want to argue that the Jews aren't really a people in the same way that we used to think of ourselves as being, then the justification for us having a country may be less pressing. There's obviously an erosion of Jewish historical awareness, but even more than that, I would say, the universalism of American life is, contrasted with the highly particularist nature of Israeli life. It's not that Israeli life is devoid of universalism, and it's not that American life is devoid of particularism, but the weights are in very different places on the scale. American Jewish life is fundamentally either religion or culture, and Israeli life is very much about nationality, nationalism, and so on and so forth. So we get at Shalem College, where I teach, we get students who come in. This is not an exaggeration. They were officers in the Army. They were in the Army for 5, 6, 7 years, some of them, but they've actually never stepped foot in a shul. And that's not, again, an exaggeration. I'll never forget the first we were there, a woman came into my office, and she'd actually been an officer in the IDF. And she said to me, when you people, meaning people like me, because she's Jewish, but when you people go into a shul, a Beit Knesset, she called it, what do you actually do in there? She had no idea. She had no idea. I mean, I kind of was shocked by that, but then I came to see that she's not as different from a large number of people as one might think. But she's not uncommitted to the Jewish people. I mean, she was in the Army. She did more years than she had to as an officer. She cares deeply. She came to a college where they study Bible and Talmud and Yehuda Halevi and Zionist literature, in addition to Plato and Aristotle and all those other people. So again, I think you've got a religious cultural expression on one side, you've got a nationalist expression on the other side. And the last thing I'll say is this, history is a mess. We just know that, right? I mean, history is really just a bloody mess. And there's a great line in Saul Bellows' book, Humboldt's Gift, where the main character says, or it's said about the main character actually, that he thought history was a nightmare, and he's an American Jew. And he thought history was a nightmare, and he'd come to America to get a good night's rest. Now, I hope our listeners won't take this wrong, but that's a great line, by the way. That's why for that book you win the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize. Turns out it's a really good book. But what he was saying was actually right. American Jews have gone to war from the very beginning of American history. American Jews fought in the Revolutionary War, in the Civil War, in the Vietnam, every war. But American Jews have never gone to war because they were Jews. America did give the Jews a good night's rest from history. If you wanted out of history, fine. And in those years when America was not at war and you weren't being drafted, you could get that good night's rest. Not only has Israel never had a good night's rest from history, ever, for one single second, Zionism was about seeking not to have a good night's rest. Zionism was about seeking to get back into the muddiness of history, because that's where the real actors on the planet make a difference, the early Zionists argued. We don't want to be on the side. We don't want to be off on the angles, kind of looking in on the center stage. We want to be on the center stage. You're going to do extraordinary things. You're also going to be involved in a bloody mess. And I think that the instinctive reaction that Israelis and Americans have to the messiness of history, which is Americans say, oh my God, keep me away from that. It's just so sad. And Israelis say, it's terribly sad, but that's how I get to be on the center stage. And I'll just give you one example. On that day that the embassy moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, not all that long ago, there's a tremendous amount of fighting on the Gaza border, which was not a coincidence. Obviously, Gaza, and the Hamas ordered their kids to go to the fence that day. And a tremendous number of Palestinian youth were killed by Israeli snipers that day. I think it might have been 60 or something. I mean, I forget, but it was a horrible, horrible day. And actually, Peter Beinart wrote a piece in the foreword, but he did not write this headline. I know who did write the headline. I won't mention her name right now, but he did not write this headline. But the headline to his article was, Israel's decision to shoot Palestinians should not surprise us, but should still appall us. Israel's decision to shoot Palestinians? I mean, really? Some commander woke up that morning and said, well, what can I do with my soldiers today? The young men and women, and they're both, who serve under me. Let's go shoot Palestinians. I mean, who in their right mind thinks that that's what happened? But I think American Jews on the left tend to say that because they're so horrified by the bloodshed at the Gaza border, by the way, as any decent human being ought to be. But the question is if Israel did something so horrendous that day, how come there were no calls for an investigation, even from Meretz or from the Arab parties? How come nobody in Israel called for a vote of no confidence? What, you can just go massacre 60 Palestinians and nobody in Israel cares? I mean, really, we've completely given up our souls to that extent? No, Israelis, including Israeli Arabs, understood, even if they disagreed with Israel's policy, if Hamas is going to send its young people to rattle that fence, and it's a chain link fence like you might have in Riverdale between your yard and somebody else's yard. Really, just you call some company and they put up a chain link fence. In parts, it's much more sophisticated than that, but in parts, it's not. And if they're going to rattle that fence and push it down, and there's kibbutzim and moshavim and yeshuvim right across the border with the elderly and with men and with women and with children, it's going to be a disaster. So Israel's for decades had a policy. If you approach that fence and endanger it, you're taking your life in your hands. So Israelis were horribly saddened by that, but nobody thought that Israelis made a decision to shoot Palestinians that day. And I think that looking at that same exact moment, Israelis feeling very sad, but saying, we have to defend this country, and they knew what they were doing. And Americans saying, if that's the kind of bloodshed that having a Jewish state is going to exact, then I just don't really want any part of it. And that's where Peter is, and the other side is where I am. I was heartbroken that day. By the way, I was also heartbroken for the snipers, right? A 21-year-old kid who sees a Palestinian in the crosshairs of their scope, has to take the shot, and they were keeping Excel charts, by the way. Their commanders were of every shot that was taken, et cetera, et cetera. But let's say I did shoot, and I did hit somebody. I still have to get in bed at the end of the day as a 21-year-old kid and know that I shot that person. I mean, my heart also bled for them, and my kids who were all in the Army, who I don't think killed anybody, but I actually don't know. They were involved in all kinds of things that gave them tremendous pause, not because it was wrong, but because it was painful. And I was proud of them that it was painful. And when one of my kids, who I won't name, called me before Shabbat and said, can I meet you on Emek Rephaim for a beer? And then that kid told me what they had seen during the course of the week. And that particular kid started to cry, literally cry. Israel hadn't done anything wrong, but it was a horrible, horrible moment. And I was actually proud of that kid, because that's the kind of kid that I wanted to raise, who would do what was needed to be done to make this place safe and survivable. But when there was a terrible human cost, not to say, therefore, this country doesn't need to exist, but to cry. I actually think that it's okay to cry. And I would actually say this, I've never thought about this before, but that's why talking to you is always so much fun. But I actually think that's what Peter should have done instead of writing his piece. He should have just cried, because it is heartbreaking. But sometimes you just have to be there and cry, and you can't give up the fight. I mean, God forbid any of us has somebody in our family who's waging a losing battle with an illness. You feel hopeless, helpless. All the doctors in the world can't make it better. And I've had this, so many of our participants in this call have had this. Really, all you can do is cry. And you cry not out of anger, and the easiest thing to be would be not to love that person in that hospital bed. But you do love them. And so the only thing that you can allow yourself to do is to have your heart broken. And I'm okay with heartbreak. I'm just not okay with giving up. And that's where Peter and I part ways, and that's where young American Jews and I part ways. And by the way, just one last thing.
Not all of them.
No, 100% correct, and I appreciate the correction. That's exactly right. But, 2 years ago when Michael Chabon gave that commencement address at HUC in Los Angeles, so we're in July now, I guess it was like 22 months ago, whatever it was, He said basically, that Israel should, stop the whole Palestinian thing. But then he said basically he's against divisions. He's against distinctions. And if Jews actually intermarry to the point that there's no Jews left, that's the way it goes. And what I want to say is the intermarriage thing is complicated. And America is a very open society, so it's much more complicated, obviously, in America than it is here. And having it be a difficult issue doesn't mean I have to give up. In other words, I can understand that people who make that choice aren't trying to destroy the Jewish people. They may just have actually fallen in love with somebody and want to spend their life with them, and that's very understandable. But we have to be willing to live in the moment of pain and in the moment of hurt. And I think too many of us just can't go there. And that, I think, is proving very problematic.
These are wise words, very wise words. I think you've actually made an excellent case for one of AJC's big priorities of very deep and thoughtful engagement of Israelis and American Jews with one another, and also deep and thoughtful education on each side about the other. Right. Very, very important. I could talk to you all day, but I am going to now turn over to Daniel Silver to get some questions in from our audience. I'm sure that there are many, many. I see we have like 51 Q&A on our Q&A box there, oy vavoy. So I'm going to turn it over to Daniel now to bring us some questions from our audience. Daniel.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Daniel. Our first question comes from Betsy Sanford in Philadelphia, who's asking, many American Jews find the Israeli rabbinate's exclusion of liberal movements of Judaism to be alienating. Should Israel be doing more to include the religious perspectives and beliefs of diaspora Jews?
Yes. I'd say more than that. I was trying to be quick so we could get to all 51 questions. No, I actually talk about this a lot in the book that Laura mentioned, We Stand Divided. Without going into it really, because it could take the rest of our time, the Israeli rabbinate is an affront to the intellectual complexity and sophistication, not only of Reform, Reconstructionist, conservative, secular Jews, it's an affront to Orthodoxy also, for reasons that I won't go into now, except to say that, yes, it's hugely problematic. At the end of the day, the reason it has never become an issue in Israeli politics, which I think makes American Jews very frustrated, is because Israel's vote security, 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 economy. Americans also have a whole priority list. And the things that are fifth and sixth on their list, for example, global warming, is going to affect very few votes in the 2020 American election. It's a critical issue, but very few people are going to talk about global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, because we got a few other fish to fry no matter what side you're on. Israelis do care about it. They do understand it as much as they understand American Judaism, which is not nearly enough. But it's just not high enough up on the priority list. And we could have a much longer conversation. But as an Israeli who happens to be a conservative rabbi, but lives pretty much in the Orthodox world, I'm humiliated, I'm embarrassed, I'm mortified by the things that come out of the rabbinate's mouth too much. It absolutely, positively needs to change.
We're going to have to bring you back to have a whole other conversation just on this subject.
But it's not a long commute. I'm in my house.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Louis Nevins in Washington, D.C. One aspect you have not mentioned yet concerns the role of some of the moderate Arab states might play in convincing Palestinians to negotiate seriously. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I appreciate it. Obviously, we're seeing some amazing things happening with moderate Arab states. Even, by the way, Saudi Arabia, that I would hardly call a moderate Arab state, is having a great warming of relations with Israel, because Saudi Arabia and Israel share one thing in common, as does Egypt, by the way, mortal fear of a nuclear Iran. So the Saudis and the Israelis are cozying up on lots of levels, some of which is public knowledge and some of which is not. But there are obviously much more Arab states in the Gulf and so forth that are cozying up to Israel. And here's something, by the way, that, first of all, it's great for Israel. It's great for Israel to have that relationship with the Arab world. It's great that, Arab public figures are now beginning to write op-eds in the Israeli Hebrew press. I'm assuming that they're writing them in Arabic and having them translated. I doubt they speak fluent Hebrew yet. But we're seeing that. They came out, by the way, for some Arab diplomats wrote anti-annexation op-eds in Haaretz, for example. But, okay, so they're anti-annexation. That's totally fine. They wrote an op-ed in an Israeli paper. In other words, that's no longer saying that state doesn't exist. That's a whole different level of engagement. So I think those are all really very good signs. One thing that we also have to point out, though, is that none of those states that I mentioned, not Saudi Arabia, not Egypt, not the moderate Gulf states, for example, none of them care about the Palestinians one little bit. They don't even really pretend to, right? I mean, when Sadat came to negotiate with Begin about the Sinai and signing the peace deal, he had a whole bunch of demands. One of them was something for the Palestinians. It wasn't clear if it was a state, autonomy, doesn't matter right now. And Begin said, a complete non-starter. Absolutely, positively not. I'm not signing a deal with one country to make you no longer an enemy and create a new country that is going to be an enemy. And Sadat basically said, okay. Right? I mean, to whatever extent there is Palestinian poverty, and there is a lot of it, the Saudis have unlimited amounts of money. Now, to be sure, the Palestinian Authority is stealing lots of it, but the Saudis could have funneled much more money to the Palestinians. They just don't really care. And the moderate Gulf states could say to Israel, we're not warming up anything with you until you make some sort of a concession to the Palestinians, but they also don't care. I'm not saying that as a suggestion that therefore we all shouldn't care. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that the people in this part of the world who understand what's happening with the Palestinian Authority, they understand that the ball is in the Palestinian Authority's courts. And they are not willing to wait for them to move, for these countries to begin to build their relationships with a power that they understand isn't going anywhere. So the great irony, right? The great irony is that the plight, and it is a legitimate, serious plight. I'm not making light of it. The Palestinians have a lousy life, and I, as a human being and as a Jew, would like them to have a much better life. But the great irony is that the lousy nature of Palestinian life is a much bigger issue for American Jews than it is for the Egyptian government, the Saudi government, or the governments of some of these moderate nations. We ought to ask ourselves why. What do they know that we're not thinking about?
Thank you. Our next question, and I'm actually going to put two questions together that we received from Zoom. Our first question comes from Jay Goldberg, who asked, do you think the peace plan developed by Jared Kushner does more help or harm to the prospects for a two-state solution? And then I'll add Manuel Rajanov's question on Zoom, who says, you mentioned what Israelis should do and what Palestinians should do, presumably regarding the two-state solution and peace. What do American Jews need to do? And if I can add, what can American Jews do?
The minute that Jared Kushner said, we've read enough history books, we don't need to read any more history books, I knew that was that. The plan is not entirely ludicrous in terms of its approach, which is that there's going to be some sort of a territorial accommodation and moves by Israel to create some autonomous Palestinian entity. Call it whatever you want. There's a lot of reasons that the specifics of the plan were never going to happen. And it's also very important to note, by the way, that whatever annexation Bibi was flirting with before Corona took over his life and everybody else's life here, so that annexation hasn't made the press here in a number of weeks, that was not the implementation of the Trump plan, right? It was the implementation of part of the Trump plan. It was the implementation of the annexation part without the implementation of the autonomy, state, call it whatever you want to call it, part. The idea of balancing that in some way is not a really bad idea. It's actually not a terribly new idea. The map itself was very complicated and problematic in lots of ways. So I don't think that it was ever a realistic plan. But here's what I do think the plan could have done had everybody sung from the same page. The Palestinians said, no, dead on arrival. We're not even looking at it. It's done. It's over. And then when it finally came out, and they were all, Schrein Gewalt, understandably, I guess, from their perspective, Pompeo said, you don't like this plan? Put a different plan on the table. If America and Europe and Israel had all said that, okay, you don't like this plan, take 90 days and put an alternate plan on the table. That would have been a good way of saying, are they serious or are they not serious? What are you actually willing to give up? What are you willing to give up? And if the answer is nothing, then the answer is that that's not how negotiations work, right? I mean, I'm looking at Laura here, but in a previous life, she was a lawyer. She knows that's just not how negotiations work. Any of us who've bought or sold a house, the price usually ends up somewhere between the two starting points. And I think that would have been an enormously productive process for Bibi to hold back and for the Trump administration to hold back and the European countries to hold back on their criticism, and everybody say, Palestinians, 90 days, clock is ticking. Put something on the table. Give us 100 pages of an idea that you have. I think that would have been a fascinating experiment. It was clearly never going to happen because at the end of the day, I don't believe that most Palestinian leaders think that they can make concessions and stay alive. And if that's the case, then what are we talking about? Sadly, tragically, right? Because my kids are all done with the army, but I don't want my grandchildren to go through that. And they're young enough that there's still some chance. But anyway, in regards to Emmanuel's question about, what can American Jews do? Look, I mean, not a tremendous amount, but let's be honest, except for showing their support and having Israelis feel that they're not alone, right? I mean, America has no shortage of issues now, to put it very mildly. Those of us who live in Israel, whether we're American citizens or we're just Israelis who care about America as a great republic, what can we do to help? I mean, really, there's a feeling of impotence, and I think many of us have felt impotent during this whole process. And I was talking to my daughter a couple hours ago. She's in Cambridge now. They're studying there for a few years. And, she's a grown-up. She's married. She has 2 children. And we were talking about the whole situation here in the world. And I said to her, this is the first time in our lives that Ima and I have wanted to help you, and we just don't know what to do. I mean, they weren't, now the kids are back in school, but when you weren't letting anybody in your house to help take care of the kids, so, I mean, I could have sent you money. It wouldn't do you any good, right? And I can't babysit the kids because I can't come there. You have a small apartment, and you're in graduate school, and he's in graduate school, and a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old cannot be sent to be on Zoom all day. So there was nothing that I could do, and it was actually a very... she had called me to reassure me that it was really okay, they're fine, but which is a nice change of perspective. But again, I mean, there's a feeling of impotence sometimes. After the whole round 1 of Corona, when it looked like Israel had come through okay, which we didn't in the end, but it looked like we had, and America was suffering terribly, there were American Jewish voices who said, well, we were there for you in 48 and 67 and 73, do something. And the frustration on our side was, do what? Like we don't have an endless number of ventilators. So what? Send ventilators over and say, please only use for Jewish patients? You can't do that. So send ventilators over and think that we as a small country of whatever number of million people have enough ventilators for Manhattan, given what was going on back then? Or send over doctors? We really desperately wanted to know what we could do, but it was very, very painful to know we care deeply. And we certainly care deeply about the American Jewish communities that were suffering so terribly. And there really wasn't that much that we could do. I think what Israelis really want American Jews to do is to say, we understand the complexity of this, right? End the occupation is like saying end taxes. Great idea. Now, how are you going to pay for stuff? Tell me how to end the occupation so we don't end up dead. And when Israelis see young American collegians holding up signs that say end the occupation, and then if they are in some certain organizations that we won't mention at the moment, and I say to them, because I know their parents, and I've known them since they were kids, okay, how would you have us actually end the occupation? And they say, we're not policy people. I'd say, look, you went to an Ivy League school. And if you'd written a paper for economics class and you'd said end taxes, and the professor had, said, but how are you going to pay for stuff? He'd say, well, I'm not a policy person. Well, that's fine, but you're also not a passing grade person. In other words, let's not be simplistic. I think that's what Israelis want from American Jews, is an awareness of the complexity of this. And I'll say, this is true on both sides, by the way. Most Israelis do not applaud American Jews who show their support for Israel by pretending that this is simple black and white. Who, if somebody like me says that there's brutality in the occupation, say, oh my God, he's a crazy left-winger. Every single person who's had a kid in the army that served anywhere near there knows that there is brutality in the occupation. Everybody here knows it. Not necessarily intentional, sometimes yes, but mostly not. But everybody here knows that there's price tag, wild and crazy kids in the West Bank, that if Israel wanted to arrest them, we would find them. But we don't. And that's, I think, personally shameful. And I don't think most Israelis, there's some obviously on the fringes, but most Israelis don't think that it's a great expression of Zionism or support for Israel to pretend we're all good and they're all bad. Because the world doesn't work that way. Marriages don't work that way. Businesses don't work that way. Student-teacher relationships, nothing works that way. And by the same token, I think what Israelis would want from the American Jewish left is to say it's complex. Yes, we are very discomfited by the condition of Palestinians under occupation. But this is not exactly an analogous situation to race issues in America. It's not. In a whole array of ways, it's not. And to say, therefore, we want to end the occupation, but how is actually a legitimate question. And to say that, look, I don't really care about those details. You just got to stop this or I can't be there with you. Most of us did not say to our kids in their teenage years, you got to stop this or I'm not your parent. You got to stop this or I'm not going to love you. We say you got to stop this because I love you and you're better than that. And that's a very different kind of discourse. And so I think what most Israelis want is for both the left and the right to stop the oversimplification, because we live in it. We know how complex and painful it is. And we don't think that we need allies for whom this is a kind of a bumper sticker thing on one side or the other. But if we felt unconditional love from American Jews for what this country has accomplished, with concern about the Orthodox rabbinate that's intolerant, and with concern about the occupation, which is very problematic in an enormous number of ways, and with concern about a whole array of other issues, and wanting to help, that would feel very different. It doesn't feel that way now.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, and I'll ask the question from Dale Sanford in Milwaukee, and I apologize to the still 70 plus questions that we are unable to get to, but from your perspective, what does this scenario look like when Israeli and Palestinian leadership are able to get back to a table and even talk again about a two-state solution?
What is the scenario? What leads to it, or what does it look like? I mean, I think I kind of answered that. I mean, I think that what Israelis and Americans and Europeans should all do is say to the Palestinians, put an alternate program on the table. We've always done it that, we cook up something at Camp David and then Arafat gets to walk away. Barak puts something on the table and Arafat gets to walk away. Omer puts something on the table and Arafat gets not to respond. Or Abbas gets not to respond. All right, let's stop that. You guys want to end this? You tell us what you're willing to compromise on. I think that, it's very hard for Israel to say that on its own, but if America, even under a Democratic administration, totally legitimate thought, right? I mean, one could have seen a Clinton doing that without any problem whatsoever. That's where I would take this. Where does it lead us? It leads us, I don't know how quickly it leads us to anything concrete, but it leads young people to see on the front page of both of their papers, they're talking. And I think that's a huge step. So that's a very brief answer to obviously a much more complicated question.
Okay, so I just wanted to thank you so much, Daniel. This was an incredibly thought-provoking and riveting conversation. I know I speak for myself. I could go on for another hour at least, but we're not going to do that to you. I hope we'll be able to continue. I hope we'll be able to continue this conversation on other occasions. And just thank you so much for sharing this time with us. It's been incredible. Bye.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.